All right, we've talked about a bunch of ancient philosophy, including Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and the Epicureans and the Stoics. There's I mean, and there are all sorts of movements. It's a period of like hundreds, if not thousands, of years. So there's obviously all sorts of movements. But the skeptical movement is maybe particularly helpful when we start looking at more modern approaches, especially the ideas of Descartes, and then soon after that, the ideas of David Hume. And they also talk about, occasionally, they talk about that sort of movement of skepticism. So I just want to kind of briefly go over some of the ideas and some of the people who defend these ideas. So probably the most famous skeptic was Pyrrho of Elis. I don't exactly know where the Elis is, but it was in the ancient Greek world. And he was around sort of the same time as Aristotle. And probably he was reacting to people like Plato and Aristotle. So, I mean, skepticism is like saying, well, I don't think there's a good reason to believe that, so I'm not going to believe it. And so what he was doing was recommending skepticism, not just as an attitude, but in some ways as a way of life. Apparently, he traveled to India and was deeply influenced by Indian philosophy, although I don't really recall a lot of skepticism in some of the ideas we've looked at, say in Hinduism or Buddhism. So I'm a little puzzled about exactly what skepticism is there too, but that's my ignorance. So what Pyrrho recommended, Pyrrho, one of those, probably there are other pronunciations too. He said, in order to achieve inner peace and not be worried about stuff, you should just withhold your judgment. You have all these philosophers arguing about like the nature of the forms or the nature of ultimate reality. And you could say, who knows? We don't know. And it's just like, well, no, I'm not going to decide. I can get through my day without ever worrying about this stuff. So rather than be worried about all these metaphysical debates, you can just say, I don't need to worry. I don't need to worry about it. So I'll just hold off on judgment. And he says that is going to be lead you to be a happier person rather than worrying about all this philosophy stuff. Pyrrho didn't really write anything down. What he said was written down by other people, or at least anything. Well, maybe he did write stuff down, but it didn't survive. Sextus Empiricus was later. He was Roman, and so more of his work survived. His attitude is basically the same as Pyrrho. He says, withhold your judgment and your life will be easier. So since he was he was later than Pyrrho, he had more to react to. So he was particularly reacting against the Stoics and the Epicureans and some of the people in Plato's Academy. And he was saying, you haven't proved any of these claims. So there's no reason to believe what you say. And so he says, well, so just don't worry about that stuff. Within the Platonic Academy, there was, I mean, initially they obviously they followed the ideas of Plato, but then they moved on, and there was a period when Plato's Academy actually promoted skepticism. One of the main figures there was Arcesilaus, and he, like all these other skeptics, says just withhold your judgment. So just a sort of a name recognition thing. Probably a more familiar name is Carneades, who introduced the idea of probabilistic reasoning. So it seems like a pretty smart idea. Rather than say either I believe something or I just totally don't believe it, you can say that seems fairly likely or fairly unlikely, or I think, well, that's probably true, but I'm not totally certain. So he introduced the idea of likelihood and probability. So he said to the Stoics, you don't have certain knowledge, but maybe some of the things you say are pretty likely, and so we can introduce ideas of probability. And he also introduced the idea that for a lot of stuff, some things you don't have to decide. Other things you do have to decide. You have to decide what you're going to have for dinner. You have to decide maybe who you're going to trust if you have two different people telling you things, and you have to make a decision between them. So there can be pragmatic considerations when you have to make a decision, and then you maybe choose the most likely of the two options. And there can be other cases where you don't have to decide, and you can just say, well, I don't know. So Carneades was interesting in that he introduced that idea of probability. There was also this guy, Anaximander, and he was in the 1st century, and he kind of spelled things out a bit more, and he gave 10 sorts of reasons that are known as 10 modes to challenge the reliability of both the senses and intellectual judgments. We're not going to go through his 10 modes, but we will look at somebody else's 5 reasons in a second. So he spelled out things in a bit more detail. So as we've seen, the skeptics, they talk about ideas of unknowable reality. One of the central ideas is that our senses can deceive us. Now, Plato said a lot about that. So Plato did have a strong skeptical streak in him. Plato says true reality is in the forms. You know that intellectually, but the real, sorry, not the real world. He would never say the real world because he thinks the real world is the world of the forms. But the physical world around us, our knowledge of that is very limited. Our senses can deceive us, and there's all sorts of reasons to be suspicious of our senses. So he recommends this attitude of hypoche, of suspending judgment rather than kind of having to choose. And he thinks that leads to ataraxia, a sense of mental tranquility, or at least freedom from all sorts of being upset or being bothered by stuff. So I mentioned 5 modes. These are from Agrippa, for sort of 5 sorts of reasons that we could have for being doubtful about philosophy or anything. So the first one is disagreement among experts. In a lot of areas, you see this obviously in philosophy, but you also see this in economics and psychology and all sorts of academic disciplines, they disagree about a lot of stuff. So if you have experts who know a lot about it, if they're disagreeing with each other, then there's a good reason to think then we don't have anything like certain knowledge. So then it's a good idea to withhold judgment. There's also this idea that if you are going to make a claim, then you should be able to support it with a basis, but then you have to prove that basis, and so you have to have to prove that, and then you seem to have to kind of keep on going to some sort of total foundation. And Agrippa said, well, that's going to just go on forever, so you're never going to be able to find a total foundation. That sort of idea will come up, especially when we start talking about Descartes, who thought that he did find a total foundation, but his claims are not actually very plausible. So there's this worry about, like, it seems like if you're going to try and claim justification, what's your foundation going to be? And that seems to be a big problem. Agrippa also talked about the idea that people's judgments are not objective, rather they depend on a particular context, they depends on their point of view, it depends on their perspective. So that means that maybe there's no absolute truth, rather things seem to depend on people's perspective. That seems a little bit like the ideas of the sophists, who also kind of talked about relativity of judgments. And we'll do a little comparison between the skeptics and the sophists at the end. The fourth sorts of reasons is that we should be skeptical about a lot of arguments because they rely on unproven judgments. So people start out with assumptions, but they can't prove their assumptions. So that means that the argument isn't really based on anything very solid. And then similarly, the fifth one, like a lot of arguments make assumptions, but the assumptions are basically what they're trying to prove. So the person is arguing in a circle, so the argument isn't going to be good. So all of that, so these five modes, and I mentioned that you can find all sorts of other reasons to doubt things, but these sort of five sorts of reasons for doubting things are the sort of fuel that the skeptics rely on, so that then they say, we just don't have reason to have certainty, and therefore we should just withhold our judgments. All right. So to finish off, talked about how the sophists also are sort of skeptical about reason, but they're strong on argument. The sophists say you can convince people with sort of fancy language, and they say, like, it's not really truth you're aiming at. What you're aiming at is just to convince people whether the views you're arguing for are true or not. So that introduces some skepticism too. And then some of the sophists argued for relativity. They say, well, there isn't any absolute truth. Truth just depends on your particular perspective. So certainly there's an overlap. But probably one of the ultimate differences is that the skeptics are aiming for tranquility, like the Epicureans and the Stoics, whereas the sophists seem to be largely aimed at getting some money. Right? They're armed at, like, sort of success. It's like a lawyer. A lawyer might be using arguments in a way to convince the jury. What's the ultimate goal of the lawyer? Well, to get paid. So that's not so much about achieving tranquility, that's achieving material goods. So it seems like that even though there's an overlap, the sophists and the skeptics have sort of different kind of attitudes to some things. All right. So that gives you just a little overview of the skeptics, and that will be useful when we start looking at some of these other philosophers.